Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. During the latter part of the 17th century, merchants and seigneurs in New France were looking for servants, and thus turned their eyes towards the Old Country. All the poor would be much better off here than in France, one merchant said. As long as they weren't lazy, there was no lack of work here, and people couldn't say what they say in France, that they have to fend for themselves because nobody is willing to offer them any work. Importing indentured laborers was a profitable business. Merchants brought over hundreds, whom they rented to colonists. For the duration of the contract, which usually lasted 3 years, the indentured laborer belonged to his master. He did not have the status of habitant. He could not take part in the fur trade and could not get married. Some indentured laborers worked as house servants, but most did heavy work, such as clearing the land. The indentured laborer earned the very low wage of 75 livres per year, from which food, lodging, and clothing were deducted. After 3 years of labor, sometimes under harsh conditions, he often ended up owning only his clothes, his gun, and his liberty. In 1665, 1/4 of the males under 15 years of age in New France were indentured laborers. Fugitives ran the risk of hanging, the whip, the stock, and hot irons. But these punishments were very rarely applied, and most indentured workers lived as members of the family. Between 1664 and 1671, roughly 1,000 indentured laborers came to the colony. About half of them stayed. The rest jumped onto the first ship they could after getting their congé, a passport-like document allowing them to return to France. A letter to France from Intendant Jean Talon complained that such departures threatened the collective survival of the colony. This colony will hardly be strengthened by the way people are heading back to France, because as much as you may promote the arrival of fresh people, several people headed back this year, and many more are waiting to head back next year, owing to the ease with which they can acquire a congé. Of the 15,000 French who came to North America between 1608 and the end of the century, only 3,400 stayed in Canada. In 1667, the French government took action. His Majesty considers it a serious problem which he must try to resolve, and for that purpose he forbids any Frenchman from returning to this kingdom, unless those making the request have a wife and children and a considerable establishment in this country. Although His Majesty recognizes that it is important no Frenchman should believe he is kept in the new country by force. What the new country offered was hope of advancement, though it took time. Marie de l'Incarnation wrote on October 29, 1665, "There are many poor people here, and the reason is that when a family creates a household, it takes 2 or 3 years before they have enough to eat, not to mention enough clothing, furniture, and a whole range of little things needed for the upkeep of a household. But once these hardships are behind them, they start to feel more comfortable, and if they conduct themselves well, then they become rich over time, as much as a new country like this will allow." The tobacco plantation system led to indentured servitude and eventually slavery in the area surrounding Jamestown and the Chesapeake Bay. Indentures are agreements between two parties about long-term work. The length of servitude might be a specified number of years or until the servant reached a certain age. Some people indentured themselves in order to gain passage to America or to escape debt and poverty. Indentured servitude differed from slavery in that it was a form of debt bondage, meaning it was an agreed-upon term of unpaid labor that usually paid off the costs of the servant's immigration to the New World. Indentured servants were not paid wages, but they were generally housed, clothed, and fed. Indentured servants were mostly white young men between the ages of 15 and 25 who signed contracts in England to work in the colonies without wages. Up to 75% of all the individuals who came off the transatlantic ships in the 17th century were indentured servants. Most migrated to Virginia and West Indies. Of the 120,000 emigrants to the Chesapeake during this era, roughly 90,000 arrived as bond laborers. Male indentured servants who were skilled artisans such as tailors, cobblers, or carpenters were in great demand in Virginia workshops and plantations. Indentured women were used as household servants and dairymaids. They did spinning, weaving, and even field labor. They could not get married or conceive until after their term of service, which was usually 7 years. Since many indentured servants were in their teen years or early 20s when they began their contract, they tended to marry later than free people, usually around the age of 30. Like slaves, indentured servants were unfree, and ownership of their labor could be freely transferred from one owner to another. Masters could also forbid the servant from travel, keeping any personal money, or working for someone else to earn extra money. Indentured servants had the right to sue their masters for a variety of reasons, and did so on numerous occasions. Their living conditions were less than ideal. The basic food for indentured servants was described as a watery gruel. Perhaps there would be a small piece of salted pork or beef to go with it, along with a small piece of bread. After many years of unsuccessful North American settlements, the English founded the colony of Jamestown in Virginia. Indentured servants played an important part in the development of the early settlement. Let's enjoy the telling of this pivotal time in American history with the help of our friends at Khan Academy.
Jamestown will become much more successful after the discovery of tobacco. Tobacco was incredibly labor-intensive to grow and process. What that need for labor meant as the Virginia colony began to grow. The very first ship bearing enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619. So just 12 years after Jamestown was founded, Africans had been brought to the area. But even though there were enslaved Africans in Virginia that early, the system of broad race-based slavery that will really characterize the American South up until the Civil War didn't get started right away, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One was it was not particularly healthy to live in this area. This is pretty much all a giant swamp. So a pretty good number of people who came to the New World in these early years died of mosquito-borne diseases. So swamp, standing water, mosquitoes leads to epidemics. So say I'm an English planter and I want to plant a lot of tobacco, many acres of tobacco. So I'm going to need some people to help me. Now, I have some choices. I could purchase an enslaved African person from one of these ships. And that might cost me hundreds of pounds. Slaves are pretty expensive. And since it's such an unhealthy environment in this area, there's a reasonable chance that any person that I purchase might die within a year or so. And then I'd lose my investment. So this is a pretty terrible form of economics, but if you're a planter in this time period, this is exactly how you're thinking. Now, my other option for help is to bring over white laborers from England, and these are called indentured servants. So perhaps there is a young man living in London. He has lots of older brothers, so he's not going to inherit anything. He doesn't have much in the way of economic opportunity, so he thinks, I could go for a new start in the new world, but I don't have the money to pay my passage on a ship across the Atlantic. So what the planters would do is they would say, all right, I will pay your fare across the Atlantic, and maybe that's 15 pounds. And in exchange, you will work for me for a period of, say, 3 to 7 years. Now, some indentures were shorter than that, some were longer, but this is a kind of a general guideline of how long they might work. And at the end of that 3 years, you will get land of your own, and I will give you some tools and clothes, things you need to succeed. And then you can be your own planter. So this was a pretty good investment if you were a young person without many opportunities in England. There's only one problem, and it's the same problem we've been talking about all along. It's that this is a swamp full of mosquitoes, and you are quite likely to die in Virginia. So this actually turned out to be a pretty good deal for the planters who were there early. They also took advantage of something called the headright system, which meant that they got 50 acres of land in Virginia. So you got 50 acres more land every time you brought one person over from England. So if you could afford to bring more and more of these indentured servants over from England, you could amass huge amounts of property, just gigantic tobacco plantations. And early on in the history of indentured servitude, very few of the servants, pretty small percentage, actually lived to finish their indenture and to make good on this promise of land for themselves and tools and clothes to get started. So this very quickly begins to build a social structure in Virginia where there are a few planters who are extremely wealthy, who own lots of land, and then there's everybody else. There's a large number of indentured servants who've only been there for a couple of years, who may or may not live to see out the end of their indenture. So this is kind of a large lower class. And then there are a handful of small farmers who managed to live through their period of indenture, are now getting started on their own. And then there's just a tiny smattering of enslaved Africans in Virginia in the early years of the 1600s.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.